Okay, folks, this is a quick review of the Heller quiz. Question 1, which Supreme Court justice wrote the majority opinion? That was Antonin Scalia. I guess it well. Question 2, were there dissents? There were 2, by Stevens and Breyer. Question 3, what was the specific question presented by the Heller case? You guys did pretty well on this. Generally speaking, the specific question was, do laws in states or municipalities that limit individual use of handguns violate the Second Amendment? Who was the petitioner? In this case, it was the District of Columbia. They petitioned the Supreme Court to hear an appeal from the lower court. What's that label mean? It means that they were the ones who brought the case to the Supreme Court. What were they doing before the case that Heller objected to, and why? Well, DC was experiencing a lot of gun violence and gun crime. And so they put in place a very restrictive law that limited who could own a handgun and how they had to maintain it. And it was a very strict law, and if you violated it, you could be in big trouble. But they had put that law into place in an effort to get handguns off the street. What was Dick Heller's job? Do you think what he did professionally had any bearing on the litigation? Well, his job, he was a special police officer, and I personally do think it had bearing on the case because it made him a much more sympathetic plaintiff to the general public, and perhaps to the judges, although they really aren't supposed to look at that kind of thing. But you know, if you're going to try to have a case with this major national social impact, then having a sympathetic plaintiff, having somebody who you can put on the front page of the New York Times or on the front page of CNN or whatever, or on talk shows, who presents in a certain way to the public can be very favorable to you. We talked earlier in the semester about the environmental perspective that judges operate within. Well, if the national social attitude towards handgun or towards the individual right to use a handgun or to carry a handgun shifts in a positive way, that may very well affect the court's decision making. If Dick Heller was somebody who did not have the training of a special police officer, if he looked a certain way or had a different kind of name, maybe, or as you saw from the photo on the weekly page, this is an older guy with a very kind of all-American name. Doesn't look like he'd be any kind of threat. Looks like the kind of guy that historically people would have thought had some sort of special place in the American consciousness. Leave It to Beaver kind of guy, that kind of thing. And if he had been a different person with a different background or a different name or a different gender or a different ethnicity, then I think that he might not have been the person who wound up being the kind of figurehead for this case. And that goes to, and the same thing was true with Obergefell. Obergefell had an incredibly sympathetic story to present. It wasn't just that he was somebody who was asserting a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. It was that he was somebody who was in a long-term relationship, whose spouse was dying, who was just asking to be treated the way every other spouse is treated when their partner passes away. He presented a very palatable image to the public, and the reason that I flag these things is just because you want to be thinking about them when these things are happening. We had the little exercise earlier in the semester about choice architecture and how people construct choices in ways that influence the choices you make. And so that happens in litigation. People who put money into these cases, and I'm not talking about the individual plaintiffs, I'm talking about the NRA or Lambda Legal or the ACLU or any of the political activist groups that support, game-changing litigation like this. They are looking for the right characters to put forward. And so sometimes they'll find somebody who seems to fit into, particular, slots in the American consciousness to become the face of their case. And that's why I think it certainly helped, I think, that Dick Heller had a background as a special police officer and had training in firearm safety, and wasn't somebody that, that the public probably was worried about carrying a gun around D.C. Because he fit certain images that the public had at the time. Question 7, besides Second Amendment, what major constitutional issue does Heller implicate? Got a variety of answers here. Some people mentioned the Fourth Amendment, some people mentioned the 14th. The one I was kind of pointing out was this is another case where you see the tension between the state's rights and the constitutional rights. In Obergefell, we saw where the state of Ohio and other states had laws that discriminated against same-sex marriage, and the court said, nope, you can't do that because as a constitutional matter, that right exists, and state laws that run contrary to the Constitution, to the constitutional matter, must be struck down. In Heller, same thing. D.C. had a law, and D.C. said, we can make this law because we have an issue in D.C., and the issue is gun violence, so we're going to have a very, very restrictive handgun licensing law. And the court said, nope, even though your municipality, your state, may have special needs, this is a constitutional right which governs all Americans regardless of where you live. And these are issues with, you can imagine if you lived in Nebraska or Montana and you lived very, very far away from police or the authorities, and perhaps there are even, animals you got to worry about, bears and mountain lions, and perhaps you're nowhere near help if you should need it from some sort of crime. People there might view gun ownership very differently than people in, Connecticut, or people who live in major cities might view gun ownership very differently than people who live in very rural towns. And the point of these cases is that when something is a constitutional right, it doesn't matter if you live in a city or a town. It doesn't matter if you live in, Upper Idaho, or if you live in El Paso, Texas, or it doesn't matter if you live in Boston, or you live in Seattle, or you live in some tiny rural hamlet in Michigan. If it's a constitutional right, it extends no matter where you are. And local places are limited in what they can do to regulate those rights, even though they may have very different needs. Question 8, does the ruling in Heller permit individuals to own fully automatic rifles in D.C.? Why were not flamethrowers? Well, in Heller, Scalia does kind of a deep dive into what the terms of the Second Amendment mean or meant at the time, and what they could be reasonably read to mean. And he kind of comes to a conclusion that the drafters of the Second Amendment meant, arms that were in regular use and were used for individual protection, and things like that. And in a bit of hair splitting, he kind of says that doesn't extend to certain things like fully automatic rifles or flamethrowers or grenades or even sawed-off shotguns. He kind of concludes that there are certain kinds of arms that were intended by the Second Amendment, and those arms are protected. That's kind of a controversial and weird take, but there are federal laws that address things like fully automatic rifles that kind of back up that approach and say that even though the Second Amendment protects your right to bear arms as an individual, the kinds of arms you can bear are somewhat limited. Question 9. This is one that no one got wrong because it's a matter of opinion, and points were given out based on your reasoning and how clear and thorough you were. Do you think Heller was rightly or wrongly decided? Well, people can have different opinions on it. Some people would say that that the drafters of the Second Amendment did not anticipate that they were giving every individual a right, but that rather that they were giving the states a right to maintain militias. Now remember that prior to Heller, it wasn't the case that you couldn't own a gun, or an individual couldn't own a gun. That wasn't the case at all. Prior to Heller, the case was that the state that you lived in had the ability to regulate gun ownership in a way that it didn't after Heller. And so the issue with the Heller case was that the court found in the Second Amendment an individual right that had not existed, in the 100+ years, more than that, that the Second Amendment had been in force. So the court found a new right, really, located a new right within the language of the Second Amendment that had not up until then been recognized. Question 10, how would you describe the language of the Second Amendment? What do you think it was intended to do at the time it was enacted? Again, there weren't any wrong answers here. This was a question that I wanted to get your opinion on. For me, the language, the actual words of the Second Amendment and the grammar and the phrasing are extraordinarily confusing. There are clauses, there are commas where you might not put a comma. There's a use of terms that aren't really defined. And so if it had been, if the language was more clearly written, why is the word militias in there? What's the word necessary mean? What's the word arms mean? All kinds of words in the Second Amendment that aren't really clear about what they meant at the time, or what the drafters meant by them. But it does seem clear that what they intended was to make sure that there were militias in the states that could react, that were armed and could react if there was some sort of attack on the states, on the country, that kind of thing. So anyway, that's the quick recap of this quiz. Good job.